What is reality? Who are we? When are we? And can times exist at the same place in different forms? Well, these are all questions of the latest piece that I've been recommended by you, the viewer. And it is quite a piece at that. That is, of course, the wonderfully bizarre and chillingly Lovecraftian BoogiePop Phantom. Now, this is a modern horror piece which gets under our skin by making us ask these fundamental questions of evaluating such fundamental truths, and then providing possibilities, but no concrete answers. That, however, seems to be kind of the point though, as one of the key themes of BoogiePop Phantom is that growing up is an inevitability, and that while the world and society around us may be full of injustices and unpleasant truths, we all must grow up at some point. Now, the series is not a complete downer, however. I mean, you could argue it even has a happy ending, and not everything is doom and gloom. However, it does make it clear to us that youth, and even reality itself, is full of pitfalls and is fleeting in many ways. From the material pitfalls of things like drugs and violence, to more metaphysical things like nihilism and escapism, these are all things that we must overcome, that we must all confront at some point. And BoogiePop Phantom is about confronting these things which scare us so, not only fighting the monsters of the outside world, but also fighting the monsters within. And this is what makes BoogiePop Phantom so interesting to me, is BoogiePop herself forces us to stare straight into the facts of our own existence, and the fact that our current existence in its current form is all we can really assert at any certain point, and that we can either run away into oblivion or tough out our struggles and emerge triumphant. Now, I really loved this piece. In fact, after completing it, I want to say it skyrocketed up into my personal leaderboard, somewhere around the lower top 10. I want to say right around King of the Hill. BoogiePop Phantom is no joke, and instead it's a rather serious, cerebral journey, engaging the viewer with its fluid timeline, disjointed narrative style, distinctive handling of its cast, deep themes, and ambiguous tones and dialogue. While not all of these sound like strengths, I assure you that the piece is crafted in such a meticulous way that all of these aspects are used correctly in the context of a Lovecraftian horror to mesh together very well and construct an extremely memorable piece of 90s anime. Although this did come out in 2000 technically. These are all amazing attributes to an amazing series that I want to say I cannot hype up enough. I also want to say though that it is worth a watch, even if it may seem from the length of this video that there's not necessarily a lot to touch on, because there is a lot to touch on. However, most of this is based in themes which can be conveyed in less time than going over the entirety of the cast in extreme detail, and that BoogiePop Phantom is also something of a ride. Not only does it enchant us with its themes and ideas, but the atmosphere alone makes it worth watching. And while that some might hold BoogiePop Phantom to be something of a quote big brain piece because of its themes, mechanics, and intentionally opaque storytelling style, understanding any of these is not critical to enjoying it. If you want to piece together a solid timeline from the events provided in BoogiePop Phantom, I think it's mostly possible if you pay close attention to every detail and link bits and pieces together, even if they are spread out over the 12 episodes. Although technically this is not entirely possible due to some reality warping later in the series, but for the most part, I think it is possible to go full Charlie Day, get a bunch of corkboard out, and assemble a timeline with some string. However, if you don't really care about that, and you're just here for the social commentary, or even just the atmosphere, BoogiePop Phantom stands very tall as well. A strength of the show is that it can be enjoyed at any intellectual level, since the unsettling and eerie elements of it are not something dependent on intelligence. Yes, it may help to be smart if you want to put all the events together and get all of the possible symbolism here. However, the atmosphere is accessible to anyone of any brainwave, and I say this as someone who has not very strong brainwaves. If my brain is rather smooth and I enjoyed this piece, I think anyone can, really, no matter what you're really looking for. The mysteries, atmosphere, mechanics, and technicals present are all very engrossing, and you don't need to be the smartest to appreciate any of these. The world of BoogiePop Phantom is, by itself, far strong enough to make it a great viewing experience on its own. There is excellence on both a surface and deeper level here. In fact, this piece is so excellent that it effortlessly passes the vacuum test. Now, this test is something I do to try and figure out if a piece of a wider franchise is objectively great. It should be known by this point that I have a policy of reviewing things in a vacuum on this channel to prevent my own possible biases from other sources or supplemental material from clouding my evaluation of the anime on its own. And I mention this because BoogiePop Phantom is an adaptation of the BoogiePop universe, which is a big old series of light novels written by Kouhei Kadono. I hope I said that correctly. And that while I was concerned that this massive compendium of source material couldn't possibly be well adapted into a 12-episode tale, I'm glad that they didn't even really try to. If I had to say it, I think BoogiePop Phantom comes off more of a great OVA than an actual anime. Yes, I know it is an actual anime and not an OVA. However, it embodies the greatest strengths of any great OVA, in my opinion, in that it allows us an interesting standalone vision into a much more extensive body of source material. It draws ideas, themes, and even characters from this source material. However, it doesn't necessarily try to tell any tale strictly from that source material. Instead, it just gives us a sort of little sampler to see if we would like the rest that the source material has to offer. As such, my concern that this would be a massively cramped story was entirely unvalid, because it's mostly an original story that happens to be set in the BoogiePop universe. In fact, this anime is more like supplemental material to those books instead of a retelling of them. And again, this was by far the smartest decision, as it means instead of trying to cram everything into a very short runtime, the story here can breathe and flow on its own in a very natural manner. Now, there are of course callbacks and references to the source material, and some events even require lore from the source material if you truly want to get the full picture. However, none of this is critical, and it is overall excellent even in a vacuum. I mean, this is a series which somehow grabbed my attention with neither a super strong cast or a solid timeline, which are two things I tend to fixate on when I watch an anime. I like detailed character development, as noticed by the way I construct my retrospectives, and I also like a nice solid history of things in order to get ingrained in the world present. However, BoogiePop Phantom kind of subverts both of these things by handling them the exact opposite. Instead of a solid timeline, we get a bunch of events that happen in some kind of order, and it's up to us to piece everything together as best we can. And instead of a super strong cast of, say, 3 or 4 or 5 people, we get a massive grouping of randos who we follow for about 15 to 20 minutes here and there to see how the phenomenon of the world affect society as a whole. Now, there are some characters which could be considered reoccurring or even main characters. However, the point of BoogiePop Phantom is not the characters themselves, but the themes and ideas that they can convey via their actions and the paths that they pursue. I usually criticize a series for having characters that act as, quote, more of a force or more of a symbol as opposed to actual people or characters, but since BoogiePop Phantom is constructed and around this idea of creating distant people to act more as metaphors, I think it's perfectly fine here. Again, this is something that is painstakingly and meticulously constructed to be like this intentionally, and it works because they fully commit to it and have so many characters that approach so many different things from so many similar and different angles. It's really something that I haven't experienced before, because even in pieces like Dura'ara, which I really wonder if this helped inspire in terms of storytelling method, you still have characters that you grow close to, that you still like, and that you're still familiar with. However, with BoogiePop Phantom, you can just turn on any random episode, and there's a very good chance that you will not recognize anyone in it from any of the previous episodes. And while this could be considered a criticism, I really like that because it really helps us ingratiate ourselves into a world that feels too big for us. And I understand that it's probably not for everyone, especially considering the timeline doesn't help any of this. However, as someone who's so used to structure in everything, seeing the weird kind of lack of structure here, or inverted structure if you will, I'm fascinated by the construction of BoogiePop Phantom on a fundamental level. Yes, the way these things are done may bother some people, but I personally liked it, and I feel like there is a great caveat here that while I think this is a masterpiece, it is very out of the box, and I can understand if someone doesn't necessarily care for it. In addition, one of the only criticisms I think I have of the show is that it does or should be watched in a single setting for maximum impact. Since there is not a lot of connective tissue here, if you do want to gather what you can, you kind of need to watch it in a binge or in 2 sessions at most. I did 6 episodes at a time, so about 3 hours here, 3 hours there, and that allowed me to get ingratiated into the world and kind of understand everything, but not quite, although I'm not sure how much there was left for me to understand and how much is just intentionally left out. However, if you love philosophical pieces, if you love horror pieces, or if you just want a spectacle of amazing technicals and atmosphere, or you love all of these things, or you love avant-garde storytelling and bizarre casting decisions, then you'll love BoogiePop Phantom. Now, I have to say that it is a super unique piece, and that I've seen nothing like it. Although, it's probably the closest anything has ever come to being Serial Experiments Lane that isn't Serial Experiments Lane. But while that piece is heralded as an avant-garde masterpiece, I want to say that BoogiePop Phantom is even more avant-garde considering how they handle the cast, which again we'll get to later. Before we get too much into that though, we should now attempt a plot summary kind of sorts. Plot of BoogiePop Phantom is actually relatively simple if we zoom out far enough, although it is wonderfully opaqued by a bunch of odd mechanics and a very Lovecraftian and disjointed presentation. Nothing in this series is presented in a linear fashion, and instead what we see is a series of events affecting various youth in an unnamed city, and how these events intersect and share common sources. Now, the source of these events is one of three unnatural phenomenon happening throughout the city. Those three phenomenon are the appearance of a shape-shifting Manticore, which eats the young, the appearance of certain youth who have mutated to have certain psychic powers, and the activities of an organization and their composite human monsters who seek to kill the evolved youth mentioned in the previous point. These are all supernatural plot points that all kind of but don't always intersect, and kind of but don't necessarily affect people at different points in time throughout the story. And what we focus on is how they affect the individuals, youth, who we spend anywhere from 2 to 12 minutes with, and who again may or may not cross paths to maybe or maybe not drastically affect the paths of those around them. In addition, when things get really out of hand, the mystical BoogiePop Phantom, a sort of mirror clone of the original BoogiePop who also shows up to set things right. Eventually, the original BoogiePop herself even shows up and finishes the jobs that the Phantom cannot. And that's really it for a plot skeleton. Now, I will go into more detail soon, but if you're not interested in the nitty-gritty, go ahead and skip to this timestamp below. As for a more detailed look at the plot, I think it makes more sense for me to kind of just state things as linearly as possible, as opposed to going over what happens in each episode. Since the plot is delivered in bits and pieces over the course of these 12 episodes, it is very difficult, but it is still somewhat possible to construct a relatively solid timeline. Now, I have to say somewhat solid, because the series itself states that due to the mechanics of the world, past and present literally overlap at points, allowing the regrets of the past to manifest bizarre phenomenon into the present. Basically, the series is about how various high school students deal with the bizarre effects of a pillar of light 1 month ago. This pillar of light is unexplained here, although from the source material I think it's from the final fight between BoogiePop and the Manticore, and this leads to the teens of this town gaining weird psychic powers and the creation of the BoogiePop Phantom, a good but extremely cold mirror image of BoogiePop, who, quote, maintains the integrity of the world by putting an end to phenomenon which, quote, strain it. Now, within all of this are the plots about Nagi Kirishima's personal quest to protect the, quote, evolved youth in memory of her dead friend, and how said friend had infiltrated the, quote, organization and given her a drug to stop her from becoming one of those evolved youth. One of these evolved youth happens to be Monaka, a gifted youth who was lobotomized by the organization, and thus inadvertently kills many of the youth of the city by attempting to rescue their, quote, inner child. Finally, there's also the organization itself and their quest to stall human evolution by killing any of the psychically evolved youth in the city. This evolution happens both naturally and artificially when this evil doctor gives people a drug to make superhumans so that she can eat them. Although this part is not really shown in the series, and I think this is more of an homage to stuff that happens in the source material. Anyways, all of these plot threads are kind of interwoven, kind of not interwoven to a certain extent, and not all are completely resolved, but they do affect each other at points, and the split nature of the storytelling ensures us that each is interesting and at least somewhat relevant to one of the others at some point. Starting with Kirishima's tale, Nagi was hospitalized 5 years prior to the events depicted in BoogiePop Phantom, and as her gifted powers were starting to manifest and affect her health. However, while she was in the hospital, she befriended the detective, I think his name is Shunpei, who was looking into the deaths of several other teens in the area. The detective had figured out that the organization was killing evolved teens and thus saves Kirishima's life by giving her a drug to undo or suppress her evolution. The detective is killed for this though, and this leads to Kirishima kind of taking on his mission of protecting the gifted youth of the city. In addition, it should be noted that no one seems to know he gave Kirishima the drug, so she's kind of just released from the hospital and free to go about her newly assigned mission. However, it's important to note that at some point while in the hospital, her blood had been experimented on by a doctor who uses it to create a drug that can also cause the evolved mutations. However, while Kirishima is jaded by having her savior and friend die, she does make sure to carry on his memory by attempting to protect the other evolved youth of the city, and this inevitably leads her into running into the Manticore, Monaka, and of course BoogiePop Phantom on various occasions. She confronts the former two while maintaining a sort of grudging respect of the Phantom. Eventually, she overcomes her issues and her jaded nature to remember the importance of human warmth and successfully grow into a functioning adult. Getting the Monaka, her plot is a more tragic one as she is the result of a drug used to create the mutations. Her mother was given it under false pretenses, and this A caused her to manifest her special powers, and B destroyed her mother's ability to use any kind of short-term memory. As a result, Monaka is forced to live an isolated life under the care of her abusive grandmother, who kills her. However, this happened on the same night that the Pillar of Light appears, and this happens to revive Monaka, who then goes on to explore the world. Unfortunately, though, the organization finds her and proceeds to turn her into an echo. That is, they basically make it so she can't speak and can only echo the words of those around her. They do this instead of killing her so that she can be saved for some kind of experimentation. By this point, she'd already learned of the ability to summon butterflies, which can literally manifest the past, and other forms of reality manipulation, and these allow her to escape. Now on her own, she uses her powers to create Poom Poom, a Pied Piper of sorts who releases a person's inner child so that they can play forever and ignore the harsh world of adults. Pulling out someone's inner child, though, unfortunately leaves their physical state in a daze, and thus actually results in the deaths of almost all the people Monaka simply wants to, quote, play with. As a result, she comes to the attention of BoogiePop Phantom, and is thus dealt with. She is hunted by both Kirishima and BoogiePop Phantom, and even the original BoogiePop, and is eventually stopped. Meanwhile, while all of this is going on, the Manticore just kind of hangs around and needs various teens every now and again. And there's also a composite human from the organization doing the same. However, he gets off in episode 7 and that plotline kind of just drops off. Quick note, a composite human is a monstrous, shape-shifting monster that the organization has created to hunt the evolved humans, and while they have a bigger role in the source material, they show up here but don't honestly do that much. And the Manticore is killed in episode 12 when the original BoogiePop tracks him down to Tokyo. Around all of this, though, are a massive mix of smaller vignettes that, while seemingly unrelated, all serve to fit in with the social commentary of the piece and kind of sort of affect the larger plot threads as a whole. It is kind of a mess, but that's kind of the point here, as this wants to see the bigger picture of societal issues and how society is functioning, as opposed to being an actual story where we actually follow a character for a long time and learn about them and see them evolve. It's a very big picture kind of piece, and I appreciate that because it kind of runs with that, seeing as the cast is very small in terms of characterization, not in terms of actual numbers. It's a very big cast in terms of numbers, and lets us know that we're going to focus on themes and the big picture as opposed to simply characters. Again, it's kind of a mess, but that's kind of the point, and I'm very aware of the fact that I probably left out a lot of things, and may even be flat out wrong about a few things, but I argue that's kind of on purpose, as the plot is structured to be as opaque as possible. It is structured the way it is for a reason. And if all of this sounds confusing or overwhelming, again, don't worry, it's probably supposed to be. And that's how such a wonderfully eerie and creepy atmosphere is created. I have no better support for this than the extremely intricate way the plot, cast, and technicals are all structured. While they may seem like a mishmash of different decisions and styles and timelines from a surface level, each is specifically tutored to the end of making a very non-linear but somewhat coherent and intricate and disconnected, distant piece. While I will get to the technicals in their own section, I want to touch on how the plot and cast structure is specifically created in a way to make us as uncomfortable as possible. By breaking everything up, the viewer is unable to easily put together a clear image of what the reality of the show is, what even has happened at what point, and they can't even completely tell what is happening when. This is all to give the viewer the same sense of unease and discomfort that many of the cast likely feel. Getting to the cast, there really isn't a core cast. I mean, there are characters who show up more than other characters, and there's definitely some that could be considered even main characters, but there isn't a main character, and great pains are taken to see that while we know the backstory of some of them, we don't really get to see much of anyone. Then this furthers our unease and in detachment by limiting the engagement enough to only really let us see how these characters can touch on the commentary present and not necessarily how they actually evolve. We can't really get close to anyone because our time with any character is intentionally limited. And this could also be a clever mirroring of the disconnect that a lot of the youth of the series seem to struggle with. Again, we will touch on all of this when we get to the social commentary section later in the retrospective. The plot and cast are structured in a way not only to feel discomfort themselves, but then to distill this into a concentrated cognitive dissonance for the viewer to digest. Now, this wouldn't work the best, though, if everything was completely random. So while the series of events in the series may seem so, they're not actually, and a good job is done breadcrumbing everything together. It is a show which is more coherent than it seems, although again that's not saying much, seeing as that it's intentionally broken up to be rather incoherent. Although it never crosses that line and instead skirts it to create as much cognitive dissonance as possible. In addition, since one of the key themes of the series is what is reality, it makes sense that a fluid one is present here, and it makes sense that the same principles would apply to how the story is actually told. The scenes may seem in random order, but when watched closely, we can clearly see some scenes in later episodes explain scenes in later ones. And I do like the fact that certain scenes are repeated from different angles or from different characters' perspectives in order to really hammer this point home and to add to our questioning of reality. I just also generally like this method of storytelling in general because it is very creative and I like piecing stuff together, which is probably why I also like Duraara. Does anyone remember that piece? Is that obscure enough for this channel? And I do wonder if the storytelling here inspired some of that stuff used in that piece. Tangent aside though, it should also be noted that BoogiePop Phantom does throw the audience a bone every now and again by basically looking into the camera and straight up saying, hey guys, not everything is linear here. The timeline's gonna get wonky, so, you know, buckle up. Even the physical mechanics are explained to a certain point, so that while we don't necessarily understand the rules of everything going on here, we do sense that there are rules and that there is some kind of order here, that this isn't just noise and images, but there is some kind of skeleton, even if it's not a very solid one. They don't explain everything, of course, but since the greatest fear is the fear of the unknown, this is a fitting creative decision. This is by far the most Lovecraftian thing I've ever watched, and I love it for that reason, and the structure and atmosphere are great parts of this. The atmosphere will also get its own segment later. And these also start to feed into the other great strength of the series though, which are its themes and social commentary. Now BoogiePop Phantom is at its core a theme piece, something which focuses on its social commentary and the messages that it tries to get across. This commentary is mostly on the negative, at home and out of the home, influences which may make growing up difficult at times, and of the need to grow up at some point. These two themes are welded to the plot structure by the third theme of what is reality. Now I won't go into detail into any of these here since they will get their own extensive segments later in the retrospective, but I do think it's important to mention them now as they will be referenced throughout the video and are key components of the series that greatly make up for the lack of a strong or detailed cast. Getting to that cast though, I want to say that while we don't get close to any of them here, BoogiePop Phantom is still chock full of surprisingly poignant moments because of how well the cast is used to convey these themes. The strength of these themes makes up for the lack of characterization, as character moments can still be impactful to us even if the characters themselves are not necessarily so. In fact, the whole series can be seen as a sort of mournful lament for lost youth, and yet the inevitability of this and the need to grow up. I wouldn't call it a happy piece, although you can argue that some of the characters do have good endings and that the piece as a whole ends on a positive note. An oddly cold, but well-intentioned piece. As well-intentioned as this may be though, it is a piece that is still very cold at times, and the tone is a very odd balance between well-intentioned and extremely cold and blunt. Some people die, and some suffer. Some get crushed by societal pressures, but others survive and learn and even have happy moments, and every happenstance is accompanied by a talk about the need to move on, and that while there may be a multitude of realities present, the only one that really matters is the one you currently live in. It doesn't really seem like it cares one way or the other what happens to the cast. It feels more like a scientific experiment than any kind of actual character story. It's definitely not a character story. Instead of really getting close to a bunch of characters and either feeling good about their fate or feeling upset about their fate, BoogiePop Phantom has a bunch of characters who just kind of suffer various fates and lets us draw our own conclusions about it. Especially prominent are the conclusions of the BoogiePop Phantom herself, who serve as a sort of reflection on the issues of the society present. It is a very odd aspect of the series, as she's not really warm, but she's not really malicious either. It's very weird, as she will bluntly state what needs to be heard, even if the opponent that she's currently lecturing doesn't want to hear it. If I had to guess any part of the series that might rub someone the wrong way, it would be the tone, as the core theme of societal issues start at home, and that it's not necessarily the sole fault of the individual, also hammers home the point that one cannot be consumed by these societal issues whether or not they affect them. What I'm getting at is that it does seem that sometimes BoogiePop Phantom blames people for the pitfalls that were brought upon by not only by themselves, but also pressures around them. It seems like it may be blaming societal issues on the individual every now and again, although I don't really think it is. And I just think that the tone here is cold because, well, it is a horror piece and that fits in line with creating a creepy vibe. And while BoogiePop Phantom isn't a warm character, it's not like she's actively malicious, and that a lot of what she says is true. In fact, if I had to guess, she's more of a mirror, showing people and telling people things that they don't want to hear, but they probably should hear. I don't mind any of this though, as I do think that the tone is in line for a horror piece, and I do like it. Something else I like, no love, is BoogiePop Phantom. This is a masterpiece of storytelling who's structured in its entirety to embody the Lovecraftian and disjointed air it sought to manifest, and yet somehow also give out rough but needed life advice and important social commentary. While it is only a 12-episode series, it does feel like the perfect length, as they went out on top and allow the series to be watched in one big sitting, which again I would recommend. They didn't run out of steam and they didn't milk this cow for too long. They told a wonderful story and then quit while they were ahead. Something also great is the setting of BoogiePop Phantom. Now, the setting of BoogiePop Phantom is one of its first aspects that we witness, and it is meticulously tailored to fit the vision of the series. It straddles the line between believable and fantastic, enabling the story to feel like something which could actually happen. It is the urban shell which gives the series an air of urban legend, something that we know that is logically unlikely or untrue, but realistic enough to really get under our skin and perhaps have even happened. Something which falls into the gray zone between fact and fiction, myth and history, knowing and feeling, intuition and discerning, myth and reality. In order to really sell us on this, the city itself is never actually named. They actually go through a lot of pain to make sure that it's not named. Not only does this make it more mysterious, as we literally don't know where any of this is happening, but it also adds a physical sense of disconnect, as we can't just look up the history or news of this place. It sequesters it off in its own fantastical and inaccessible corner of our world. It's one thing to say, I saw the Rat Man of Des Moines, and there's a city in Iowa where they feed people to a giant rat. These are two very different statements, and by refusing specifics, the show is both more accessible, as it refuses the audience opportunities to specifically disprove specific claims, and it's more mysterious. It might exist is fundamentally more eerie than it does or does not exist. The gap between fact and fiction will always be more tantalizing than either extreme. Getting to the city itself, while the phenomenon in it are of course fantastical, the city itself feels pretty realistic. There's busy shops, a metro system, offices, schools, drug dealers, back alleys, parks, a hospital, a sprawling suburban rim, and many other common elements of a big city. On a brick and mortar level, everything seemed believable and in line with what we would see in our real world. And even though there is a supposed unfinished underground city, this looks more like an extensive tunnel or subway system than, say, Tokyo 2. There is something off about this city though, and it does feel oddly cold and inhumane. This is not a prominent element of the series. I mean, it is prominent, but it's never a defined prominence. The city always just feels cold and inaccessible, like the concrete itself shuns any kind of human interaction, and everyone here is more trapped than alive. It feels very unpersonable, and maybe it's just my own bias against large urban centers, but there does seem to be some kind of unidentifiable miasma about the place. It's not all glitz and glamour, but also heartbreak and danger. In fact, the city itself reflects on the heartbreak of many of the characters here, as its constant growth mirrors the constant growing pains we see throughout the series. One of the themes of BoogiePop Phantom is the painful but important process of growing up, and the city itself mirrors this as it's literally building up new parts of itself. Past, I want to say episode 6, there are constant statements about how much the city is growing, or that it's almost unrecognizable now, just like many of the youth here are growing into whatever versions of themselves they will be as adults. And I really like this all-in theming, as even the setting of BoogiePop Phantom is dedicated to conveying the themes of the series. Another aspect of this is how BoogiePop arranges its temporal setting. Now, there are two components to this: the actual fluid timeline of the series, and the fact that it is nebulously set in the, quote, 90s. Starting with the more simple and latter aspect of this temporal setting, let's touch on the placement of the series in the 90s. Now, you might think that this is simply because, well, the piece is made in 2000 and they want to keep it relatively recent or contemporary. However, placing it in the 90s is also extremely fitting, as this was the infamous lost decade of Japan, where the economy basically went belly up and a pronounced era of economic stagnation took hold. It was an era completely different from the decade that preceded it, and it was a rude shock to the nation and its people. Not only does this explain the kind of downer energy we get from the series, but it also provides a sort of impetus for both its social commentary, and it is a reflection of the nation's energy as a whole. The city isn't just down, kind of the whole country is by this point in the 90s, and the unnamed city is a reflection of the constant pressures, not only to get the ball rolling again, but also the disillusionment which may come with failing to do so. I mean, you see throughout the series, there is a lot of pressure to get into a good college, or to get good test scores, or to get a great job, so on and so forth. And while these were big themes and parts of the prosperous 80s, by the 90s and the lost decade, these are kind of losing their point, and a growing sense of disillusionment has set in to the national mindset. And this is reflected in the piece itself. As set in a time of downturn and disillusionment, these fit perfectly within the creepy atmosphere and social commentary of BoogiePop Phantom. Getting to this social commentary for a second, setting BoogiePop Phantom in the 90s also comments on many of the dangers of the big city that were present in the national conscious at that time. It molds fantastical tales using realistic issues like social anxiety, isolation, mental health struggle, drug abuse, kidnapping, etc. as realistic components to make the fantastical hit home. While these all are, of course, real social issues, they are added to certain parts of the series to add a visceral and accessible level of discomfort to the vague and supernatural one present. In addition, while these elements are emphasized, BoogiePop Phantom does not feel like a moral panic piece. Instead, it feels like a piece which combines urban fears and legends with real social issues to create a world that is full of not only vague danger, but accessible and visceral danger. At least that's what it felt like to me, and I really like this combination of the weird and supernatural with the down-to-earth. Getting to the more fluid timeline component of BoogiePop Phantom, this is another way the temporal setting greatly fits the nature of the story as a whole. While we can craft a mostly linear timeline from various scenes in the show, this isn't really the point nor entirely possible, and this is because BoogiePop Phantom sees overlapping timelines occur in certain places where the past and present literally happen at the same place at the same time, and I don't know how linear that is. Opaque storytelling emphasizes this, but indeed BoogiePop Phantom herself goes out of the way to literally tell the audience this on occasion, so we know that a entirely accurate timeline is probably impossible to construct. This isn't always a metaphor. This is literal. Sometimes the past and present literally and physically interact and intersect, not only creating interesting narrative opportunities, but also feeding into the Lovecraftian fear of what is reality. And the show even gets away with kind of explaining it. Now, at the core of any great horror piece is a big massive unknown, as the fear of the unknown is the greatest fear known to human. And while BoogiePop Phantom certainly has this mass at its core, it does manage to provide a sort of scientific explanation of what's going on here, and get away with this. I didn't expect a piece like this to really explain any sort of the mechanics here, or even take that idea too seriously, but the fact that they do this, and the explanation is even creepier, is amazing to me. Now, the scientific explanation provided by the series is basically this. Reality is simply the perception of the human mind. That is to say, nothing might actually exist how we see it, or even at all, and that everything is simply a construction of the mass of flesh in our head known as our brain. As an electronically based lump of flesh, though, this brain, of course, is susceptible to electromagnetic phenomena, especially fluctuations in electromagnetic fields around us. This means that a big enough disturbance in any of these fields can and will mess with our perception of reality, allowing us to perceive things we realistically can't, like the past. In addition, if reality is just perception, this means that any disturbance in it would hypothetically allow us to perceive physical changes too, explaining how overlapping timelines can have physical effects like they do in the series. Now, if this sounds like technobabble, I'm pretty sure it is, because while we do know that the brain uses electrical impulses, and it is indeed rather squishy, I don't think the whole what is reality thing has or can be 100% scientifically proven, and that's more of a philosophical debate. What all this means, though, is that, at least in our minds, there is a plausible element to a lot of the stuff being said and witnessed here, and the fact that it does seem plausible makes it more concerning or disturbing than, oh, this is clearly a work of fiction. The fact that they even bothered to explain it at all makes it seem more plausible. Although it's not explained to the point where we can take comfort from any kind of explanation, and it's still left very confusing and intimidating. And I love it. A similar but less detailed approach is taken with how the mutants are explained, as the series does actually kind of explain this by saying that they are the result of evolutions in the human brain. And while this does sound less realistic to me, again, they do try to explain things in a way that it both satiate the viewer's quest for knowledge, but leave enough doors open to still be unsettling. Overall, the series does a great job balancing mystery and exposition. I mean, we do eventually learn of the organization and how electromagnetic field disturbances affect perceptions of reality here, but nothing is explained beyond a surface level, really. Enough is done to lay a foundation, but not enough is done to explain away any of the fear or magic of the series. However, it should be noted that a lack of physical reality, or a possible lack of physical reality, is no excuse not to live a good life according to BoogiePop Phantom, and it's no excuse to commit to radical escapism. As whether or not the setting of BoogiePop Phantom actually exists, the themes of the show are still important. In fact, a possible lack of an actual setting emphasizes them, as BoogiePop Phantom herself goes on to say that in spite of an infinite possible amount of realities, there's only one reality that you currently find yourself in, the present. And whether or not this is the result of human brainwaves, or of the Earth Turtle, or anything else, how one conducts themselves in that reality, the one they find themselves in, is ultimately up to them, and there are right and wrong ways of conducting themselves. While there are social issues that may cause people to stumble, BoogiePop Phantom seems to say that that's no excuse to just give up, and that you can't blame all of your problems entirely on others. All of these factors, though, create an amazing setting and atmosphere, which give the piece such a unique feeling. It is a perfect blend of urban legend and dark fairy tale. In fact, the atmosphere alone is enough to justify watching this series, which in and of itself is an incredible feat. And bringing this feat to life are some amazing technicals. Now, while we just gushed over the setting, let's now gush over the physical components to how that setting is brought to life. BoogiePop Phantom was made around 2000, and is a very stylized representative of the new softer art styles which were superseding the iconic style of the 90s. This very foundation is very sound, and it's soon greatly built up upon. I love the lighting of the city, and I think it's drawn in a way to feel rather real. The dark scenes are extremely dark and discomforting, and the bright scenes are still very bright and let us know that no, this is not some crazy gloomy ghost world, but instead the real world in which ghosts may lurk. The character designs are also very grounded, and a uniform, relatively mundane style was set upon from the start in order to make the supernatural stuff really stick out. Sticking with this, the color palette is also rather drab, fitting for a horror piece, while Stylized is nothing super out of the box. It's nothing abstract, and it's all rather grounded. In terms of a foundation and designs for standard characters and the setting, a rather boilerplate approach is taken, and this is then stylized in editing and later touches. I've never seen a piece that is so stylized on a technical level, and I don't mean just in art style or in the sound design, but how these are themselves modified to fit the creative vision present. There are a ton of little things done throughout the series to really sell the ideas of it. Looking at the edges of the frame, for example, you see this blurring. Now, you've probably noticed the fuzzy edges of the frame by this point and thought I did that for copyright reasons or something, but this is actually a conscious addition to the final product by the producers themselves. Yeah, that's a baked-in feature that is in 11 of the 12 episodes simply for the sake of selling the dreamlike atmosphere of BoogiePop Phantom. And a lot of the shot composition does this too, as while there are a lot of conventional flat or conversational shots, one thing you notice throughout the series is that there are many empty frames with dialogue over them, creating a sense of disconnect and unease. There's a lot of shots designed to make characters feel small too, again enhancing our unease. Small touches that really get under your skin on a subconscious level seem to be a speciality of a lot of the designs and shot composition of BoogiePop Phantom, and they're so prevalent that they drag you into the world of the series, and I must say it's extremely jarring when you finally get to episode 12, and a lot of these little things are just not there anymore. It's like waking up from a dream. Or a nightmare, as a lot of the things that BoogiePop Phantom does seem intentionally designed to make it feel like a kind of nightmare. Something which is logically untrue, but still hauntingly close to reality, or at least seemingly so when we witness it. The way the technicals mess with our perception is a sort of reflection on how the cast themselves struggle with creating their own identity in the process of growing up. And it is unclear whether or not everything is literal or metaphorical at times, which again makes sense when one of the themes is what is reality. When the show really wants to mess with the viewer, they'll even cut to real life photography, which is something to really break our immersion and to unsettle us. The final break in any kind of immersion comes with the installations of breaks in each episode. Now, one of the weird quirks of BoogiePop Phantom is that each episode has its own number of, quote, scenes, denoted by a little card and containing its own little bit of the story of the episode. There is no set amount of these scenes, and there's no set length for any of them. Instead, they all feel very natural. It's whatever feels natural, before basically hard cutting to the next scene in a very unnatural way. And this is a way of breaking up the flow and pace of the series to have the viewer always on edge. And it's great. The soundscape also fits in with this, as a good amount is done with the voice acting and the original soundtrack to enhance discomfort. Starting with the voice acting, it is a very weird thing to judge. The large disconnected cast means that no one really gets a point to shine, and they all kind of sound a little similar even. But I argue that's kind of the point. Most of the dubbing just feels kind of gloomy and a little samey, although this does feel like an intentional effort to make everyone kind of blend together, just like in a dream. It creates disconnect between the viewer and the show, and prevents us from growing too close to any readily identifiable characters. I do want to make a quick amendment to my statement that a lot of the voice acting is probably done to sound gloomy on purpose, as Kirishima's VA does sound noticeably different, and I think I recognize the voice of Vincent Law as Drug Kid. I haven't confirmed that, but it does sound like him. In addition, while most of the humans sound kind of dull by design, they do make sure to add in vocal filters and weird sound effects. Now, vocal distortion is only applied in two scenarios mostly. One, it's almost always applied to BoogiePop Phantom's voice, so we know that this is the BoogiePop Phantom and not the actual BoogiePop, although you can't tell if you look at the faces close enough. And also, whenever something really grave or serious or impactful or ominous happens. If the vocal distortion is applied to a normal human character, and then we know that this is an emotionally impactful or ominous moment. And I do like how they often tinker with the sound design and balancing of the actual vocal recordings in order to drum up atmosphere and suspense and whatever else they may be trying to go to. A lot of details are paid attention to, and I really like whenever supernatural beings talk, especially BoogiePop Phantom. This is never used completely consistently though for any character, which is probably a creative decision designed to unnerve us. As for the original soundtrack, It's used very well. Sometimes it's used ironically, sometimes it's used jarringly, sometimes it's simply a fitting piece, and I love the intro to this anime, as it is very unfitting for it and kind of eases us into the wild ride ahead. It's also just a great funk piece. Throughout the series, there's also a lot of rough cuts in many of the songs to intentionally create breaks in both them and our perception. There are hard cuts to silence that serve the same purpose. I love the juxtaposition between the soulful and relaxed opening and the frantic underground scene used in the actual show. I do love it. It is a ambient house kind of jungle mixtape masterpiece, highlighting many of the underground artists present in Japan in that time. I can't confirm that, but I was told that according to a YouTube comment. Anyways, I love this kind of music. It is the kind of relaxing ambient stuff I would listen to in my own free time, and you can bet that I've listened to this soundtrack in my own free time. I also want to say that it is ironically very relaxing, and that it is another testament to the excellent editing of the series that such relaxing pieces can be used and cut up in ways that make them extremely distressing. I love this fact because it makes the music both ironically horrifying and unironically horrifying. Some of the pieces are intentionally made to be somewhat disturbing, to sound glitchy, to sound reality breaking, and those aren't unironically horrifying. They do fit in with the horror motif very well. However, ironically, many of the pieces are so relaxing that when we see them over disturbing imagery, we kind of get a lot of mental dissonance here that says, whoa, what's going on here, guys? Which also leads to a sense of horror. Objectively, I think the pieces are great, and while it's not the kind of thing that'll, everyone would like to listen to in their own time, I really dig it. And I think that it is an amazing OST that I would recommend to any people who are fans of, that kind of relaxing ambient house kind of sound. While I have commented on the great use of the soundtrack and the great use of many of its songs, the OST is also masterfully used when it's not used. What I mean by that is that BoogiePop Phantom, while having a great OST, is not afraid to throw around the weight of silence, and often the most ominous scenes don't have any music to them at all, and there is a masterful use of eerie silence throughout the series, or eerie ambience throughout the series, as a lot of the background sounds are also very good at being realistic but kind of creepy. A lot of electrical buzzing, a lot of low tones, a lot of things that you could see hearing in the real world, but you can't necessarily identify. Good at creating a kind of fearful curiosity. One of the other comments I want to make about the original soundtrack is that while it is small and everything is of a kind of electronic or jungle genre, it does cover a lot of different tones in the sense that not everything is a slow, relaxed piece, not everything is an energetic, fast piece, and it is a very versatile original soundtrack in spite of everything kind of being of a similar genre. Now, talking about a few more miscellaneous notes about the sound design, I do like a lot of the weird things that we see. They do use some public domain classical stuff, and I know this because I recognize the song in the end of episode 2 from Evangelion, and I don't think this is the Shiro Sugisu rendition of whatever the song is. I don't remember it, and I'm not going to look it up if I'm being honest, but I did like seeing that little touch there. And another thing that I noticed, and this is the thing that stood out to me the most, was a collection of samples from the famous Distorted Reality sample CD from Spectrasonics, which was released in 1995. Now, for those of you who don't know, sample CDs were basically CDs that were instant public domain sounds that anyone could use for their projects. At least that's how I understand it. I'm not really familiar with this, so if anyone could leave an unnecessarily long and detailed comment about sample CDs, and especially the Distorted Reality one, I would really appreciate that. Anyways, this specific demo CD, Distorted Reality, is one of the most famous ones ever released, and while you may not recognize the name of the CD, you definitely recognize some of the sounds. In fact, I recognized the samples titled Tension, not from the show, but from their use on the Animal Planet channels of The Most Extreme. In fact, I thought that was original music for that show until I looked it up after hearing it on BoogiePop Phantom soundtrack and going, wait, is this some kind of like public domain thing? And then finding out that it's from this famous demo CD and learning what a demo CD is. If anyone wants to leave an absurdly long comment explaining more about this specific demo CD or the specific track, please be my guest. Another thing I'd like to give a quick shout out to is the dropped pipe sound effect, which is prominent throughout the series. Finally, I'd like to mention the little musical motif of BoogiePop's whistle theme. This is a little whistle we hear whenever she or the Phantom are going to show up, and it is a neat little touch that in-universe it is heard, as we hear several people comment on several occasions when they hear that whistling, they know that someone is coming. I didn't really know where to say this, but I wanted to say that episode 11 is titled Under the Gravity's Rainbow, and I was wondering if that is a reference to the book by Thomas Pynchon. Now, I've never read that book, and I have no idea what it's about. Its Wikipedia plot summary seems extremely confusing, if I'm being honest. I just know of it because I saw a link to it on the Wikipedia page for Blood Meridian. Anyways, if this is a literary reference to such a confusing book, I do think it's fitting because allegedly it's also very non-linear like BoogiePop Phantom. Getting to the character segment, I was really divided on how to do this, but since BoogiePop Phantom is not a character story, and in fact the core design element of the series is how distant the cast is from the viewer, I've simply decided to write a few catch-all paragraphs on how the cast is handled, and then tackle a few on an individual basis. Starting with how characters are handled as a whole by the series, it's important to note that they're not really characters for the most part to get attached to or grow, but instead simply engines to drive both the plot and its themes. There are a great deal of characters we only see in one episode, and even the ones that we do see in multiple episodes are handled in a way to maintain a sense of distance between us and them. This isn't failed writing or a result of poor planning or too large a cast, but instead a subtle form of dehumanization and obscuring to fit the social commentary and general atmosphere present. I have made comments in some videos of mine that X character feels more like a force than a person, and meant it as criticism. Although I do think that BoogiePop Phantom is an exception to this, as the whole series is kind of designed around the idea that you're not going to get close to any of the characters, and that it's really more about the messages they convey than the characters themselves. There is a very intentional attempt to let us see enough of the characters to convey their points and their places in the short stories of the universe, but nowhere near enough for us to kind of settle in and focus on any of the cast present. This is so that our focus is still mostly on the atmosphere and social commentary. BoogiePop Phantom is designed as much of a ride as a narrative, so using its cast as roadside curiosities instead of actual characters is fine with me here. It's rather odd, but it does work because it's very in line with the core vision and is handled very elegantly. While this is a rather unconventional handling of characters, it does make sense for a horror piece and adds to the scope of the world present, making us feel even smaller. It's designed to make us feel a bit alone and confused, just like the cast. A cast which is the center of a bizarre coming-of-age story. Now, BoogiePop Phantom is, of all things, a coming-of-age story, although it's constructed in probably the least conventional way possible. Typically, these sort of stories focus on one or two characters who do a lot of stuff, have a lot of struggles, and eventually grow into their adult form by learning important lessons. Usually there is some kind of familiarity with these characters and the viewer, and there's a lot of focus on one or two characters at most. BoogiePop Phantom is almost the exact opposite of this. Instead of an emotional, close examination of a few people and sharing in their important life lessons, BoogiePop Phantom feels more like a cold and scientific look at a pool of test subjects who are simply left to their own devices. It's like the series simply wants to let as many people pursue as many paths possible in order to observe different paths and their strengths and weaknesses, and then allow us, the viewer, to judge their validity. I mean, the series does have its own views, but how it promotes them, indeed how it handles most of the cast most of the time, come off as extremely cold and calculating or scientific and distant. While it does promote correct lessons about growing up and such, the tone isn't friendly or nurturing in any way, and it's more somewhere between factual and borderline judgmental. Again, I don't think it crosses the line into judgmental. However, it's probably the most disconnected way to build this kind of story possible, where we do witness people growing up and do learn from them, but it provides such a wide pool of candidates to learn from that we don't actually grow close to any of them. I don't think it crosses a line at any point, or that this is a weakness of the series. However, it is a very unique aspect of it, which makes touching on the cast difficult. All this is to say that while BoogiePop Phantom could be considered a series with too big a cast to flesh out, who act more as forces and metaphors in a narrative sense than actual people, that's all okay, because this was set upon from the start, and is in line with the social commentary, artistic presentation, and general construction present. Getting to know the actual characters let's start with the Manticore. Now, the Manticore is one of the big bads of the series that we see pop up throughout the story and serves as the quote basic monster component of this urban fairy tale. In line with its mythical title, the Manticore is a supernatural beast with powers including, but not limited to, shapeshifting, super strength, super speed, and at least to me is some kind of hypothetical hypnotic power. His only goal is just to feed on humans and, fill his appetite, and he uses a variety of methods to track down his prey. He doesn't seem to be particularly picky, and while popping up every now and again, is eventually put down by the original BoogiePop herself in the final episode. Like all monsters in folklore, though, the Manticore can not only be interpreted as a literal monster to be feared, but also a kind of metaphorical manifestation of some destructive human vice. In this case, the cult of consumption. Whether it be material, or gluttony, or anything of the like, it seems like the Manticore manifests boundless hunger and the destruction that comes with letting that go unchecked. It destroys the youth who are lured in by it, and its promises. It can take many forms and consume almost anyone, and no matter how much it feeds, it's still hungry. These things also apply to the Manticore as an individual on a physical level. While these are simple, they are effective takeaways from the Manticore that I assume the series was trying to get across. Now I note this caveat because this character is actually a sort of, and I'm quoting here, shadow of the beast from the original source material books, and therefore there is probably some source material I'm missing. However, I do think there is enough to work with in BoogiePop Phantom itself. Also, I want to note that his death in those books is the actual unexplained light in the anime, which kind of kicks off the entirety of it. Now, I'm not sure how he's characterized in those books, but even though the Manticore is fierce and dangerous, he's also characterized as a bit cowardly and even pathetic in BoogiePop Phantom. Just as his powers can manifest the dangers of consumption, his form and characterization show how it can drag a person down on a sort of human level. Where a fierce monster might inspire some kind of fearful respect or reverence or awe, the Manticore is not given that air, and if I had to put it in Zoomer terms, bro has no aura. I mean, he's literally given the form of the neighborhood loser that everyone picked on beforehand. And I think this is an intentional creative decision to show that the vices he manifests will destroy not only those around you, but you yourself, and will lower you and your standing in society. He is a menace to the youth of the city, but BoogiePop Phantom dunks on him constantly and scares him, and even Kirishima, a normal human, gets the jump on him at least once or twice. A point is made to show that even if powers can come with the aggressive pursuit of hunger, it doesn't necessarily make you cool or even that strong for that long. Either way, the Manticore, while one note, does serve as an excellent urban monster, and even brings some good metaphors to the table. And I guess that gets us to BoogiePop Phantom herself. BoogiePop Phantom is not the actual BoogiePop, but, and I'm quoting here again, a shadow of the Manticore's power that takes the form of BoogiePop herself. End quote. You see, while there is the single Manticore that's kind of the big bad of the series, in the events prior to this, as hinted in a flashback in, I believe, episode 6 or 7, BoogiePop Phantom is actually the remnants of the other Manticore. See, in the drug episode, which happens before the Pillar of Light, we see that there's two Manticores working together. There's the one that takes the form of the creepy guy, and there's this other one that looks strikingly like BoogiePop Phantom. We see in a later flashback that the original Manticore, the male, took the form of creepy guy, and the other Manticore, the female one, was killed. However, her energy scattered upon her death, and being completely unaware of its surroundings, took the form of BoogiePop Phantom, ironically taking the form of the one that killed her, and even taking up her own mission. Now, I do like this arc, as while it is something that you wouldn't really get to if you missed that flashback, which is easy to, because I know I did a couple times, or if you're not familiar with the source material, it sets up BoogiePop Phantom on a kind of weird redemption arc, even though she herself states that she has no idea what her past life is. So it's arguable that, this can't be a redemption arc because she doesn't know what she's redeeming herself for, and that she admits to acting out of a simple mechanical manner. However, I do like this, as it does add to the complexity here, and it does set up the idea that if the Manticore had taken a different form, perhaps he could have redeemed himself or lived a better life. Although much colder than the original BoogiePop, she has essentially the same look and mission: to serve as a stabilizing force by pursuing supernatural beings too powerful for the current balance of the world. Basically, she's just an edgier BoogiePop who serves as a sort of anti-hero until her dissipation near the end of the series. Like the Manticore though, while BoogiePop is limited in screen time and characterization, there is still some stuff we can gather about her and her character, and it is a very fascinating way the character is handled. First off, BoogiePop Phantom is very aware of and unbothered by the fact that she's not the real BoogiePop, but instead a sort of weird bootleg clone. And I do like the fact that when they meet, it's a rather amicable meeting. I note this not only because it helps the viewer see what's going on, but also because it shows some kind of self-awareness or confidence on the part of BoogiePop Phantom, two things that the Manticore doesn't seem to possess. BoogiePop Phantom is immediately shown to be rather wise and in control, and that while she is cold, she isn't portrayed as a malicious force, but more a sort of righteous destroyer, and the show does a good job showing her as more of a necessity than a malignant being. She doesn't seem to be interested in killing or really anything, if I'm being honest, but she does carry out her inherited mission with brutal efficiency. As a result, she's extremely matter-of-the-fact and cold, not really justifying her actions besides saying that they are needed, that the stability of the world depends on this, and that she's seemingly aware of and unbothered by the fact that they can be rather morally gray at points in time. She's not a monster. I mean, she does, quote, preserve the gifted youth of the underground so that they can dream on unto the rest of humanity catches up with them, instead of killing them or killing them herself, but she is instead a manifestation of the harsh nature of reality, as she coldly destroys those that would harm others, and pursue escapist fantasies past the point of pulling them from reality. Just as she is sort of a mirror of the original BoogiePop, she serves as a metaphysical mirror for everyone involved, being the blunt but honest voice telling them, you can't run forever, you need to face the facts, or your escapism is destroying lives. And while these may not be what people want to hear, sometimes they're things that people need to hear, and BoogiePop Phantom is that voice, is the character that gives voice to these things, and this is why she seems like a sort of anti-hero to me. She is rather cold, and arguably punishes a few people who are victims of the system themselves, but she only punishes those who have already hurt others, and she never hurts the innocent, and everything she says is true. And while delivered in a very cold, matter-of-the-fact way, that doesn't negate the fact that a lot of what she says is generally good practical life advice. And it is a fascinating character, capped off by how little we actually see her. Yes, while the show is literally called BoogiePop Phantom, she's not in most of it, and her presence is a great way of hammering home the points of the series and letting us know that something big is happening when she does show up. And this leads us to talking on the real BoogiePop, who is the alter ego of happy, friendly Touka Miyashita. This character, while being a big part of the source material, and she does have the same mission as the BoogiePop Phantom, although she is noticeably warmer and more benign. She's more good than great compared to her clone, and, well, that's really all I got here. Look, while this series is a spin-off of the BoogiePop literary universe, this isn't called BoogiePop, it's called BoogiePop Phantom, because that's the main focus of this anime, and not necessarily the original BoogiePop herself. And I'm fine with this. It's a creative way of allowing BoogiePop Phantom to create its own story, to be its own thing, and then not mess with the canon stuff. In a weird way, this kind of anime filler to the books themselves. And it is perfect filler content in this context, as everything is mostly self-contained here, and the stars of the source material show up for some raw moments to give the fans what they want. And the lack of BoogiePop kind of adds to the charm of the series in my opinion, as it is just another weird facet to note. I guess this means though that we should also quickly touch on Touka Miyashita, the youth who harbors BoogiePop. Now Touka does pop up throughout the series. She kind of makes little cameos in a bunch of episodes, whether it's one line here, or a couple lines here. So it is nice seeing that she is present throughout the series, even if her BoogiePop form is not necessarily that present throughout the series. I think she's the first BoogiePop we see, like the one in episode 1, and she does, along with her BoogiePop persona, make scattered appearances throughout the series. However, seeing as this anime is kind of filler supplemental material to the original novels, I understand that Touka and BoogiePop don't show up that often, and don't necessarily need to, because this is its own story. So I think there is a nice balance here of seeing the main character of the source material, and allowing the source material to breathe its own life. Like BoogiePop, she's hardly in the series, although I do like to touch that she comes from at least a functional household, as it adds to the commentary that a lot of social issues start at home, and a healthy home can create positive and friendly youth who use their talents for the better. And that's basically Touka in a nutshell. She's very friendly and positive, and who, while unaware of her power, does use it for good. And I mention her powers being used for good because one of the other prominent characters here, Monaka, uses her powers for not good. Now I say not good as opposed to evil, because while Monaka's actions do get people killed, this is more the result of misguided intentions than actual malevolence. For this reason, she's probably the character of the most note. She is a tragic character, given a decent amount of backstory, which references most of the social commentary of the piece, referencing what is reality, the social ills of the era, and that many of these issues start at home. In the field of interrupting reality, Monaka herself can literally distort it by using her special powers to create butterflies that can manifest the past and literally warp reality. She has the power to literally revive the past, and is a source for many of the phenomenon in the series by creating Poom Poom, her Pied Piper, which tries to help people but ultimately ends up killing them. Poom Poom himself is a manifestation created by Monaka, who brought to life the memory of a troubled youth who wanted to be a fairy tale writer. Monaka and Poom Poom then befriend the troubled youth by pulling their inner child out of their current physical form and taking them to Paisley Park, a tasteful Prince reference. While she does do this out of benign motivations, simply wanting to help people escape from the real world, doing so kind of kills them as their physical form, their remainder if you will, lose touch with reality and then die in various means, usually accidental or self-inflicted. And this is what I mean when I call Monaka misguided. Her goal is far from inflicting the harm that she actually does, but is instead to help those around her by carrying the suffering off to a magical world where they can leave behind the pressures of the world and simply play. This abandonment of the real world has consequences, of course, though, and thus she is eventually put down by BoogiePop Phantom. Monaka's desire to play is driven by her past traumas. She never had a normal childhood, and instead grew up extremely isolated and abused, touching on social issues starting at home. Monaka grew up with no exposure to the outside world, and was thus overwhelmed when she finally entered it. This was worsened when the organization captured and mentally injured her so that she can only repeat the words of those around her and no longer talk for herself. All of this abuse, though, ingrains within her mind two things. One, adults don't know or forgot what really matters, and that what really matters is being nice to and appreciating those around you. And two, that the real world is often horrible, and as such should be avoided as much as possible. Both of these beliefs have logical pretenses in her mind and past, and neither is malevolent. However, they do create a psyche which is unwilling to grow up, and her power to distort reality is a literal metaphor for how adopting bad mental hygiene can distort one's own perception of the world, and that this is rather dangerous. Monaka is not to be blamed for her trauma, of course. In fact, a good job is done showing that she's a tragic character, whether it's her abusive grandmother, to her borderline lobotomy, to the fact that her creation itself was simply the result of the bad doctor exercising some sick impulse that also destroyed her mother's brain. However, this doesn't justify Monaka getting others killed, and her refusal to accept the facts on the ground for so long. This refusal kind of stunts her and makes it impossible for her to have an honest conversation about things and actually finally move on in a healthy manner. And this is proven when Monaka finally achieves peace, not by continuously running away or running far enough from her problems, but by actually talking to her mother and coming to accept the realities of the world as she is dying, which affirms the final theme of the need to grow up. Overall, Monaka is a manifestation of both a child's unfocused and unrealistic naive frustrations with adults and their ways, and how embracing these frustrations completely, how refusing to grow up and embracing escapism, can only destroy someone in the long run, or at the very least extremely stunt them. It's an extremely fascinating that she is a tragic Pied Piper of sorts, manifested as Poom Poom, and the Prince references in both his name and Paisley Park are very nice touches. Next is Suema, and she's here too. Okay, so there's more to her character than that probably, but again, I feel that since I review this in a vacuum, I'm missing a lot of her bigger role in the source material. Here though, she does serve an important part of a kind of every person. She does of course have her own struggles and grow through them, but she lives a relatively mundane life and is relatively unaffected by the mysteries of the series. This is important as it adds some relatability and believability to the narrative. In a piece like this, it's very important to have mundane characters here and there in order to punctuate the supernatural. In addition, her growth shows that while the youth may struggle a lot, there's still a good chance for many of them to grow up into fine, responsible members of society. She's kind of a more plain and mundane version of Nagi Kirishima in her own arc, who undergoes more of the typical pronounced anime character development as opposed to the more solid, realistically stuff manifested by Suema, before serving as a kind of final link between Kirishima and Touka in the final episode. I do like that they set up these connections early on, and that even though these are not really main characters, as BoogiePop Phantom doesn't really have a main character, they're the three most prominent characters, and Suema does a good job linking everything together in this aspect. And that finally gets us to Nagi Kirishima, who is arguably the main character of this piece. Now, as detailed earlier, Nagi is a troubled youth who almost became an evolved human, and has since dedicated her life to protecting them in order to carry on the memory of both her father and the detective who saved her. She is a cold, troubled youth who overcomes her issues and tragic past in order to prove that we can do the same. Now, she's cold and righteous because of her past, although she does get warmer as she evolves and even seems to eventually put the past trauma behind her, as she starts off the series living off in memory of others carrying out their missions, but by the end of the series she seems much more relaxed and ready to live out her own life and carry out her own missions, finally doing so in episode 12. If anything, Nagi proves the importance of needing to push through stuff as opposed to run away, and doing so allows her to survive many of the temptations around her and grow through her struggles. Her strength does seem to come from a rather jaded origin, however it allows her to hold off long enough to maintain her own identity and eventually smooth out her personality's rougher edges, growing strong not only out of a survival instinct, but out of a genuine confidence that allows her to live a more peaceful life than what she had known before. If Monaka is all about looking away from the facts of the world and not growing up, Nagi stares at them constantly and arguably grows up too fast, becoming technically savvy but cold and distant until her chance meetings with the reporter and her own character growth help her remember the importance of human interactions. And that gets us to the rest of the cast, a slew of characters who are only in 1 or 2 episodes and serve more as commentary on certain issues as opposed to characters themselves. While this might sound like a complaint, since BoogiePop Phantom is designed around characters being used in this manner, I don't consider it a weakness of the series, as it is obviously pretty intentional, and everyone in this group does comment on some relevant issues pertinent to the show, which I guess we should get to in a bit. Quick note though, I do want to say that the random characters displaying various issues facing the youth of the series is fitting because there's a lot of different issues a lot of youth are going to face, and I like this approach of having a certain youth manifest a certain issue because it allows a face to be given to a certain thing as opposed to just having one character deal with everything. I understand that it is realistic that people will have to deal with multiple issues at multiple times, but it is a neat little subdivision on the part of the series' use of the cast. And I do think it's thematically appropriate that we don't get too close to any of these people, as a lack of substantive relationships is a shared core source of many of their issues. And I know that character sections are usually the meat and potato of my works. However, due to the way the cast is handled here, I don't really think there's too much for me to add on here other than the disclaimer that I probably missed a thing or two, and that I don't want to waste your time by making surface level observations about characters who aren't really designed as characters from the start. Now, the themes of BoogiePop Phantom are really the meat and potatoes of this video, of this series in fact, and while they can be succinctly summarized, they are of undeniable importance to the series as a whole. While there are many things that can be drawn here from various sources and episodes throughout the series, I think that the main themes are those that have been stated ad nauseum by this point. That we all must grow up, and that negative influences from many sources, often societal, can derail this process. Starting with arguably the most important theme, a key theme of BoogiePop Phantom is the inevitability of growing up, the inevitability of the progression of time and change. BoogiePop Phantom makes it clear that this is not something which can be avoided or postponed, but instead a necessity or natural process that will occur whether we want it to or not. We cannot control what will happen, and we cannot necessarily always control the pace of what happens and when, so instead we must control how we handle ourselves when things do happen. BoogiePop Phantom goes out of its way to say that life does indeed suck sometimes, for some people more often than not. However, that's not an excuse to stagnate, to regress, to lash out irresponsibly, or to run away from the real world and the facts on the ground, as doing so will only hurt oneself and others in the long term. Instead, struggles are to be trudged through until you reach the other side. Time doesn't stop until you can't either. Therefore, it's important that one must learn to accept the realities around them instead of lashing out or completely shutting them out. However, it's important to note that in the context of BoogiePop Phantom, and indeed in our real world, growing up is not simply just getting older and getting a job and paying taxes. No, instead it also involves more complex developments within the human psyche, and part of this is learning how to deal with past traumas, setbacks, pains, trials, tribulations, etc., etc. And I bring this up because at its core, BoogiePop is a show about trauma and how people deal with it. In fact, this is one of the most constant motifs in the entirety of the series, and if we look at every character here, even though we don't necessarily get to know them very well, they all deal with some kind of trauma that affects them to be the way that they are now, and some of them deal with it successfully, and we see this, and some of them deal with it not so successfully, and we see them pay the price for this. There are a lot of broken people in this show, and I want to make a caveat that I don't think that's necessarily a social statement. I don't think that's saying that everyone's broken or that urban society is completely evil. I just think that this is a show about trauma, and, that requires examining traumatized people. But this all ties back into how BoogiePop Phantom is a very kind of scientific coming-of-age story, as not only is it looking at a variety of people growing up in a variety of ways, but how a variety of people deal with a variety of trauma in a variety of ways. And it's important to mention that it's trauma in general and not the specific here, as everyone deals with their own issues, and the point is more a blanket examination of how the human psyche possibly deals with and comprehends and moves past or struggles to move past traumas, instead of a specific issue at hand. Not everyone here is a drug addict. Not everyone here has experienced a loss in the family. Not everyone here is dealing with X issue. Instead, everyone's kind of dealing with their own issues, and this is an examination of how the human in general can deal with such grievous blows to the human condition, and the social and individual repercussions of struggling to do so in a very fitting way. When I say fitting, I mean healthy. I don't necessarily mean in a way that conforms to strict social expectations, and this is important to note because a distinction between these two is made in the series itself. There are characters who abide by strict social constructs and kind of repress their trauma as a result. In fact, that's kind of the entire plot of episode 6. As we can see, that's not healthy, and that perhaps some strict social constructs should have been done away with in order to really address the pain at hand. On the other hand, BoogiePop Phantom does say that we do need to take others into consideration, and that social norms do exist for reasons. You can't just take out all your trauma on those around you, and you can't use it as a catch-all justification for immoral actions. And we see this in episode 3, where this lady is punished for claiming to love the world, but really just being a sort of passive accomplice to the Manticore's own nefarious agenda. My point here, though, is that part of growing up is dealing with trauma. And since BoogiePop Phantom is a story about growing up, it's therefore also a story about how its characters deal with their own traumas, telling us that there are right and wrong ways of doing that. However, overall, it says that we must learn how to deal with these things, because if we don't, they will hold us back and possibly even harm us or those around us, hence limiting our ability to grow up and therefore be our best or final versions of ourselves. Trauma is not something that someone necessarily deserves or has asked for, but not learning how to handle it properly can negatively impact them and delay the growing up process to a point of extreme detriment to not only the individual, but everyone around them. And I think that's one of the core points of BoogiePop Phantom, and why its theme of growing up is so important, even if it is handled a little coldly. We cannot stop change, and we cannot stop time. Therefore, we must learn to move on and accept or deal with the things that have already happened. in some way that is conducive not only to healing, but in maintaining responsible behaviors, attitudes, and actions. As mentioned earlier, I feel that one of the only possible criticisms of BoogiePop Phantom is that it is a little callous as to how it handles many of the struggling youth throughout the series. Many are simply told to move on, and while BoogiePop Phantom doesn't lash out at some of them, it's often very clear that she doesn't really care about them either. In fact, it may seem at times that victims themselves are being blamed, although this usually only occurs after they hurt someone else, which means that there is room to criticize them and punish them because they do end up hurting others. And this creates a lot of moral gray zones where BoogiePop Phantom will take out someone who, while obviously having done wrong, was wrong themselves. Well, there is a lot of moral gray here. They all do push towards the idea, though, that we must accept reality and move on. Unflinchingly and brutally enforced these are still important things to learn. And I think that this is intentional, as again, BoogiePop Phantom is not supposed to be some kind of righteous hero or savior, but instead a morally gray agent of stability, often serving as a stark mirror to both her victims and the viewer, and does so more than serve as a solely malicious force. Regardless of how they got to where they are now, the youth are handled in a very sink or swim kind of way. And I could see how this creates some criticism, as in many cases, they are victims of the system themselves and not just bad actors. They have been worn down by societal pressures and peer pressures and many other negative influences that have led them to pursue the path that they currently pursue. Most of them are probably victims of some unfortunate circumstances themselves, be it broken households, to murder, to other things, and no one sets out to be a killer or a failure. However, BoogiePop doesn't care about the minutiae of everything because it holds that how the individual acts upon their pain is ultimately still up to them in the long term and at the end of the day. BoogiePop Phantom clearly states that being hurt does not justify hurting strangers. Put simply, to what the extent the individual is responsible for their current woes, BoogiePop Phantom A doesn't really care, and B states the undeniable fact that time cannot be stopped, and so if someone wants to move on or live a better life, they gotta figure out some way to handle their pain that can manifest in some kind of inner peace or growth. The delivery and handling of this may bother some, as I do think it realistically can be criticized as callous. However, I don't see any real way to argue against the idea of you have to move on and grow up at some point. It is a theme which is conveyed extremely coldly and bluntly as possible at times, I'm assuming in order to maintain a creepy and objective tone, but it is a theme which is still very applicable to everyone. Being wronged is no excuse to wrong others, and learning this is a core component of what BoogiePop Phantom considers growing up. Time and time again throughout the series, we will see how a young person is led astray by their own struggles and pressures, originating not only from themselves, but also from various societal issues and pressures around them, leading them to commit some great folly that then they are punished for. They are not punished for anything that has happened to them, but how their responses to this may negatively affect others in very drastic ways. This is an important distinction to make, as it paints BoogiePop Phantom as more of a stark and blunt reminder of the dangers of escapism, of solely blaming others for your own flaws, and of self-righteousness, as opposed to a malicious piece beating the hurt while they are down. For an example of this, let's look at how the series handles Monaka. Now, Monaka leads a very tragic life, from her horrid childhood to her very inception as a medical experiment, and there's no denying this. She suffers grievously at the hands of others for no fault of her own. Her past traumas warp her worldview and her actions, and it undoubtedly paints someone who has a very grim view of many of the things around her. It paints someone who is willing and ready to lash out. However, she's not punished for her views or for her past trauma. Instead, she's punished for how they lead her to trying to, quote, save other troubled youth. It is only at this point, when her actions have hurt others, that BoogiePop Phantom interferes with her life at all. It's important to note that while BoogiePop Phantom is portrayed as extremely cold, she's also portrayed as some kind of pseudo-righteous character that punishes those who have wronged others, which by this point, Monaka has. BoogiePop Phantom only punishes her once she's actually acted upon her pained views to an extent that drastically affects others negatively. She is punished for these actions and not the pain that spurned them in the first place. Noting this, it is a little odd to me that the series never goes all the way to promote some kind of actual dialogue in many of these cases. You know, like there's no real examples of someone being prompted to talk through their pain. I mean, I'm sure it happens a couple times, but it's more of an individual initiative as opposed to the series promoting it as a whole. And everything is handled in a very sink or swim manner. Nonetheless, the point here is that one cannot live in the past alone, nor use it as a catch-all justification for their actions. The past will always be surpassed by the present, so it's pointless to try and run away from the very progression of time and change itself. Doing so is dangerous, and this is literally manifested here when Monaka's power to literally revive the past only causes bad things and is thus forcefully stopped. Accepting the realities of the world, or refusing to do so, reflects on how Monaka uses her powers to literally distort reality. She says this is to bring happiness, but it doesn't really, and it's not sustainable, and all it really does is get a bunch of people killed. Exploiting her powers, a metaphor for fixating on the past, only causes suffering. We all must grow up, and hopefully grow out and over our pains, but regardless of who we are, fixating on our pains past a certain point is undeniably self-destructive. And yes, this message may be seemingly delivered with the sensitivity of a frostbitten finger from time to time, but I don't really see how I can argue with it at its core. Time and change are simply inevitable. And while BoogiePop tends to tell the individual to simply push through everything in a callous way at times, and it does seem a tad odd that there's no emphasis on making friends or talking through issues, BoogiePop Phantom also makes a very prominent point of stating that a lot of the pain that the people have in this series spawns not necessarily from themselves, but from societal pressures and issues pertaining to a hardcore drive to achieve quote-unquote success. And this does get us to the social commentary of the piece, which, if zoomed out far enough, can be simply summarized as, quote, excessive societal pressure can cause the youth to make bad decisions, and much of this pressure comes from prioritizing a seemingly standardized definition of achievement, social standing, and material, the prioritization of which over the individual leads to disillusionment, bad decisions, and suffering. Now, the pursuit of a rigid, singular definition of success more often results in failure, especially if said pursuit is forced upon someone like it is here, and if that person may not necessarily even agree with the cookie-cutter definition of success. A constant point is made by almost every adult in the series that their kids need to get into college, that they need to do this in order to get a respectable job. However, it's important to note what respectable, what successful, what all of these things are is defined by the parent, who seems to have some kind of arbitrary definition, and not by the student themselves. And this is an excellent example of that idea that uniform success criteria are not uniform because everyone has their own definition of success and what gives them happiness. However, the fact that college is fixated on by basically every parent except Touka's, I think, and that many interactions between parent and child focus more on surface accomplishments like this, as opposed to actual heartfelt or sincere conversations about feelings and issues, is a stark criticism of fixating on the surface level. I understand that the parents want their kids to be successful, but the fact that they so rigidly define success for their child and push them so hard to pursue it, as opposed to acting as a supportive backstop, is a negative trend throughout the series. Almost every interaction between parent and child is very rigid and restrictive, as most of the adults here simply tell the kids that all that matters is that you go to college and get a prestigious job, to the point where the youth are asked to sacrifice their own personal dreams and ambitions, and dare I say their own individuality, to pursue what their parents have arbitrarily defined as success. It's important to note that they themselves may not agree with what their parents state as success, because success is, to some extent, an individual thing. You may be content living in your current situation, or you may not be. However, your level of contentness is ultimately up to you. BoogiePop Phantom seems to hate the idea that the youth should become cogs in the machine, even if it states that they must inevitably grow up, as if they must grow up, they should be allowed to do so into themselves, and not into some cookie-cutter definition of success. Now, that's not to say that most of the adults here are heartless or they don't love their children, but simply that they've been blinded by a uniform and blasé definition of success given to them by the society that they live in. It's a simple condemnation of the cultural tendency to ask someone, what can you do, before how do you do? And when this is the case, when success and being more prestigious than those around you is prioritized over actually interacting with someone and getting to understand them and supporting them and helping them grow, we start to see a lot of disillusionment spawn. And this, of course, can lead to upsets, to anger, and a myriad of other negative tendencies, as the fixation on rigid societal norms often creates a lot of societal outcasts crushed by the mold arbitrarily deemed success that they are supposedly needing to break themselves into. Now, look, there's nothing wrong with any of these kids going to college and getting a fancy job if they want. Education is something that should be pursued by anyone that wants it, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to better yourself through education. However, the fact that this is a task assigned to the youth here by their parents, as opposed to by themselves, and pursued at the expense of their own agency, is a stark criticism of the system here. It's so rigid, in fact, that the students are criticized for even pursuing majors of their own interests. We see this student who wants to get a literary degree crushed by the fact that she got slightly higher math scores and thus is forced to become a math major. There is no room for individuality in a society or system that prioritizes a sole definition of success, and BoogiePop Phantom is a moody proclamation that it's more important to focus on people than their achievements, social standing, or whether or not you deem them successfully, because success, although having material measurements, is to some extent subjective. BoogiePop Phantom is a criticism of fixating on social status and achievements over the individual, as doing so doesn't really help anyone and only tends to breed disconnect and disillusionment, something we see a ton of in most of the parent-child relationships throughout the series. There is a ton of disillusionment here, and this is shown to be the source of many, many, many of the various social issues present, whether it be drug abuse, mental health struggles, bullying, etc., etc. When someone is constantly pressured to pursue a goal they don't really fully care about, comprehend, or even see as their own, there's no real incentive to buy into that system, to play by the rules. As such, a key theme of the series is how the youth can be led astray by bad habits and radical decisions, spawning from disillusioned apathy, rage, and sorrow. While BoogiePop Phantom does state that the conduct of the individual is ultimately their responsibility, it makes pained efforts to state that the pain and disillusionment that individuals have that may cause bad decisions is often not solely their own fault, but can come of a mixture of their own decisions and of societal pressures, anxieties, and the lack of strong bonds needed to counteract these. Note how most of the kids led astray throughout the series are coming from broken households, and that even though we don't spend much time with any character, they make a point of stressing this motif constantly. Even though we don't necessarily get to know a lot of the teens here, and I don't even remember a lot of their names, I do remember the countless scenes of broken households. These children in turn must undoubtedly feel that their own individuality and agency are under threat, which feeds into the disillusionment already mentioned, because they are so worried and crushed by the expectations of their own parents and society around them, all the while being extremely disconnected to these two, because all that's really focused on is expectations and not actual personable traits or connection. Although the students are held accountable for their own actions by BoogiePop Phantom, and there is an honest discussion about how the youth must grow up, there is a blatant criticism of how the adults and the society that they construct need to properly nurture and engage the youth, as opposed to simply heap a bunch of expectations on them. They make a point of showing that most of the parents here are either abusive or distant from their children because of these expectations, and as a result they have no anchor to steady them in the sea of societal pressures and bad decisions. The preoccupation with achievement can distract from what's actually important, and that is the bonds that people share, to the point that the bonds themselves are seen as a distraction from all the surface level and ultimately less meaningful stuff. Poom Poom makes a point of this when he rants about how adults have forgotten what really matters. And while BoogiePop Phantom does admonish him and Monaka for using their pain to justify their dangerous actions, she never actually corrects this specific point of his. She never actually criticizes his point that they have forgotten what is really important, and that their prioritization of material measurements of success has blinded them to their own child's pains and their own bond with their children. If a child's natural talents and abilities are nurtured and properly guided, then they can succeed in their own field, in their own way, in their own time. But if the same mold is forced upon everyone on a rigid timeline, it can cause the youth to kind of quiet quit and give in the bad decisions in an attempt to run away from it all. Material success doesn't directly translate to happiness, and the blind trust that it can is a serious societal issue that can destroy people, and especially the youth. The series is at times a mournful lamentation of this lost youth, in fact, lost youth that has been sacrificed on a pyre of stale, cookie-cutter, uniform, and ultimately sometimes unobtainable definitions of success. In this way, BoogiePop Phantom is a brutal criticism of society as a whole, and I want to say the rigid nature of Japanese society especially. There is a lot of pressure on the youth to obtain something that people define as success for them, and BoogiePop Phantom is a rebellious way of saying no, the youth must be allowed to grow up on their own terms, to achieve success by their own terms. And ending on this very serious note, I do want to state that there is another third theme to quickly touch on. The theme of what is reality is the final little motif I'd like to touch on before I get to the conclusion of this retrospective. It is something which is touched on both literally, the literal reality is often distorted here, and metaphorically, as the social reality is often distorted and touched on a lot as well. On a literal sense, I really love how the constant questioning of what is actually happening gets us into the horror and Lovecraftian aspects of the series even more, and it is neat seeing how these things are creatively used to disjoint the timeline and then kind of allow us to piece everything back together. I do love that. However, on a more metaphorical level, the idea of what is reality is a questioning of what is our social reality, that is, what is our social expectations, and are they what they should be? Often this touches back to the ideas of disillusionment with a rigid system present, as a lot of the youth start off or are told of this uniform reality that success means getting this poshy office job, and then they see BoogiePop Phantom and some supernatural events deconstruct literal reality, and this reflects how their metaphorical reality of success is deconstructed, only for them to put back the pieces on their own terms. And I really like this interplay of the literal mirroring the metaphorical, and the metaphorical mirroring the literal. It is a nice little amendium that complements both the technicals and visual aspects of the series, the surface level stuff, and the thematic social commentary, the deeper aspects of it. In fact, it's kind of funny how this is something that the series kind of goes out of its way to set up and then purposely not answer. One of the key ironies of BoogiePop is while it is renowned for its disjointed timeline and bizarre reality fluctuations, the series itself kind of states that none of that really even matters, as even if there is a possibility that there are many, many different realities that one might find themselves in, the current version of you, the individual, will only ever find yourself in one at a time, so it really only matters how you handle yourself in that one reality, that is, the present. And I really like this because it kind of cuts the crap when we think about it. It says, yeah, there's all these different possibilities and sources and whatnot. However, we kind of have to zoom in on ourselves sometime and just say, I am here in the present, and I need to conduct myself accordingly. I really like that because it is a very blunt and succinct way of holding someone accountable for their actions or reminding them to do so in a series which, although opaque in its storytelling, is rather blunt in its themes. And that brings us to the conclusion of the BoogiePop Phantom retrospective. Look, I apologize for the short length for this. It wasn't my intention for this to be my shortest retrospective yet, but more so than anything I've ever talked about on this channel, BoogiePop Phantom is something that must be experienced and witnessed for oneself. There are things that may be similar to it in some aspects of it, but nothing that is quite like it in its meticulous construction and artistic stylization and execution. In fact, it's a bit difficult for me to comment on many aspects of it, because many of its unique aspects, from its plot construction to how it handles its cast, to its surprisingly deep and simple themes, require really your own experiences. BoogiePop Phantom is the ride of a lifetime, and someone telling you about a ride is simply not the same as taking it for yourself. That being said, I have tried to comment on what I would think is the most important aspects of the show as much as I could without bogging myself down in either extreme and meticulous surface level details, i.e., I don't really think the order of what actually happened here is that important into 100% detail, or surface level character analysis stuff. Now, I know that I certainly missed some important bits and pieces probably, and there is a ton of stuff that I just omitted because I didn't think it was that deep, and this includes a lot of the one episode characters. However, I consider the omission of stuff like this fine for the sake of streamlining the retrospective, as omitting small things doesn't affect the big picture view of this retrospective, which is what a retrospective should try to go for. I don't really think I need to spend 15 minutes dissecting the drug guy and his character when his character is only in the series for 20 or so minutes and dials into the big themes that I already touched on. No, I don't think it's necessary for me to explain that he's an example of a disconnected youth being lost to poor decisions resultant of social disconnect and social pressures, i.e. the big themes that I actually talked on. My point is that, like this series, I consider this one of my more free-flowing works, and for that reason it's actually been one of my favorite scripts to type up, as I have managed to somewhat loosen up the rigid structure that I usually stick to. And it was a nice little exercise trying new things out. BoogiePop Phantom plays fast and loose with a lot of things, and I was forced to make improvisations to my standard structure and methodology as well, and I like this little mental exercise. Now, that's not to say that the series is an incoherent mess though, and in fact it has a very unifying method to its seeming madness, as everything is tied together by concrete themes, atmosphere, and stylistic decisions spawned from literally everything being tweaked to suit the core artistic vision present. In spite of its scattershot storytelling, BoogiePop Phantom feels like a piece with a vision that is simply presented in a slightly out of order to drum home its themes and atmosphere. This is not a piece like Samurai 7, which trods along a tight plot, nor is it a bloated mess of loose ends like Rossifon. Instead, and hear me out, this is a tight exploration of its themes, which, as themes do not require the same temporal rigidity to construct and comment on that a plotline might, BoogiePop Phantom's temporal non-linearity is not an issue here, as the themes and atmosphere are what are prioritized here, and this is done so successfully that the series is allowed to pursue its intentionally weird narrative and character structures at its own leisure, and in fact these are repurposed to factor back into the themes that are at the core of the series. In line with the idea of allowing the youth to grow up their own way and achieve their own definition of success, BoogiePop Phantom doesn't try to do what's been done before, or construct a standard narrative, or even bother with having really anything close to a main character. But instead, BoogiePop Phantom says and shows what it wants to, its own way. I love the bold passion of the creative team for purposely going out of the box in almost every way possible, simply because that fit their creative vision. Not since the Big O have I felt like production team has mastered the marriage between their work's themes and its actual writing and production techniques and execution. In fact, in this regard, it's probably surpassed the Big O and anything else I've seen, seeing how literally everything here is crafted around its unique narrative goals. And I love that. I love this piece, and I love its bold energy that, while sometimes cold, still has important and impactful messages, and arguably even a happy ending. I love the looks and sounds of BoogiePop Phantom, and I love everything about the series that is so crafted in such a special way to fit its themes so meticulously. I love that this is art for art's sake, and a project which is like nothing else, and may never be even replicated in any way ever. And I love this obscure anime memory.